The wind moves slowly across a wide northern field, bending the tall grass as if the earth itself is holding its breath. It is the year 937, and somewhere in the north of England, two armies are drawing closer to each other, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. Before the sun sets, thousands of men will be dead. 5 kings will never see their kingdoms again. 7 earls will fall into the mud beside common farmers and fishermen who only months ago were working their fields. And by the end of this single day, a country that does not yet fully exist will be born in blood. But right now, in the quiet before dawn, there is only anticipation that on one side stands a king who believes he is building something the island has never seen before. His name is Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, son of Edward the Elder, raised in war, forged in uncertainty. He is not just fighting for land. He is fighting for an idea that the fractured kingdoms of this island can be bound into one realm under one crown, but on the other side gathers a force so vast it feels like the island itself has risen against him. There is Constantine II of Scotland, old, experienced, hardened by 3 decades of rule. A king who has survived rivals, invasions, betrayals. He has bent the knee once, publicly, but never in his heart. There is Olaf Guthfrithson, young and ambitious, ruler of Viking Dublin, with salt still in the seams of his ships and conquest burning in his blood. York was his by inheritance, by right of sword and lineage, until Athelstan took it. And there are others. The Britons of Strathclyde, Welsh princes, Norse warriors from across the Irish Sea, men who, for generations, have fought each other, now united by one shared fear. If Athelstan succeeds, their independence dies forever. To understand why this battle is about to happen, you have to understand something unsettling. England does not exist. Not really. What we call England is still a patchwork. Wessex in the south, Mercia in the middle, Northumbria in the north. And for nearly a century before this moment, Viking armies have torn those lands apart. When the great heathen army arrived in 865, it did not come to raid and leave. It came to conquer. Kingdom after kingdom fell. Northumbria shattered. East Anglia erased. Mercia broken. Only Wessex endured. And even that survival was fragile. Alfred held the line. Barely. When he died, the map of the island was still carved in half by the Danelaw, Viking-controlled territories stretching from London to York. It was Alfred's children and grandchildren who slowly clawed it back. Fortress by fortress, town by town, year after year of grinding war. By the time Athelstan took the throne in 924, something new was forming, something larger than any Anglo-Saxon king had ever ruled. And in 927, he did what none before him had managed. He marched north and seized York itself. The Viking kingdom of York, symbol of Norse power in Britain, fell into his hands. That was the moment everything changed, because conquest is one thing. Dominance is another. Athelstan summoned the other rulers of Britain to meet him, a gathering of kings. They came. Constantine of Scotland, the rulers of Strathclyde, Welsh princes. They acknowledged him. They gave hostages. They swore oaths, and then they went home and began preparing for war. Humiliation does not fade quietly, especially not among kings. Constantine had ruled Scotland for more than 30 years. He was not a young man to be intimidated by a rising southern power. When he handed over his son as hostage to guarantee peace, it was not surrender. It was calculation. He was buying time. Across the Irish Sea, Olaf Guthfrithson saw opportunity. York had been his family's prize. Ethelstan's seizure of it was not just political, it was personal. And Olaf commanded something few others on the island could match: a fleet, hundreds of longships, warriors hardened by campaigns in Ireland, men who lived for war. The alliance that formed in 937 was unprecedented. Scots, Vikings, Britons, Welsh contingents, even warriors from the Northern Isles, if later whispers are to be believed, enemies for generations, now bound together by necessity. Their plan was simple. Olaf would sail across the Irish Sea with thousands of warriors. Constantine would march south. They would join forces somewhere in northern England, overwhelm Athelstan with sheer numbers, shatter his army, divide his lands, and erase forever the dangerous idea that this island could belong to one king. In O'More, England, just the old order. Fragmented, familiar. Safe at in the summer of 937, sails appeared on the western horizon. Villages burned as the coalition army advanced inland. Smoke rose in dark columns against the sky. Refugees fled south with stories of an army so vast it seemed without end. Chroniclers would later describe it as innumerable. A flood, a tide of steel and shouting voices. Modern historians estimate perhaps 15 to 20,000 men. For the 10th century on British soil, that is staggering. But Athelstan was not blind. His network of informants had warned him. He gathered the FYRD of Wessex, the same tradition of citizen warriors that had resisted Viking invasions for generations. He called the men of Mercia. He summoned his household troops, professionals trained for war. And at his side rode his young half-brother, Edmund, only 16, but already fierce, already determined to prove himself. They marched north, somewhere, and we still do not know exactly where. The two armies found each other. The sources name the place as Brunanburh, but its precise location has vanished in a time. Yorkshire, Lancashire, the Wirral Peninsula. Scholars debate. The earth keeps its secret. What we do know is this: it was open ground, wide enough for two massive shield walls to face each other in full formation. There would be no clever flanking maneuvers in grand tactical brilliance. Just men, shields, spears, swords, and the oldest form of decision humanity knows. Dawn. The sun rose over that field, what one poem would later call God's bright candle. And as its light touched helmets and spear points, two civilizations stepped forward and crashed together. What followed would be remembered, by those who dared remember it, as the greatest slaughter the island had seen since the Anglo-Saxons first arrived centuries earlier. And the killing had only just begun. The two armies do not charge wildly. They move forward slowly. That is the first thing that surprises you. There is no chaotic screaming rush at the beginning. There is discipline. There is tension. Thousands of shields lift at once. Wooden faces rimmed with iron, painted with symbols of kingdoms and families. The sound is not a roar. It is a low vibration, boots pressing into earth, the thud of spear but striking the ground in rhythm. Ethelstan's men formed their line carefully. The West Saxons in the center, Mercians anchoring one flank, household troops placed where the fighting will be thickest. Young Edmund somewhere along the line, not hidden in the rear, but visible, because this is how loyalty is earned, by bleeding beside your men. Across the field, the coalition forms, Scottish warriors with long spears and heavy shields. Norse fighters gripping axes polished from years of war in Ireland. Veterans who have burned monasteries, stormed fortresses, and survived storms at sea that would terrify most men into retirement. They are not farmers called up for duty. Many of them are professionals in violence. Then the horns sound, and the distance between them disappears. When two shield walls collide, it is not elegant. It is not cinematic. It is brutal physics, which slams into wood. Iron rims bite. The impact shudders through bones. The first rank absorbs it like a living barricade. Men in the second and third ranks slam forward to add weight. Suddenly the world becomes inches wide. You cannot swing freely. You cannot step back. Your shield is pressed into the spine of the man in front of you. Someone's breath is hot against your ear. Someone else is shouting a prayer you cannot hear over the grinding roar. Spears thrust over shoulders blindly, searching for soft places, face, throat, groin. When a spear finds flesh, there is no dramatic pause. The body jerks, collapses, and is immediately replaced. The line must not break. This is what decides kingdoms. Not speeches, not crowns. Pressure. For hours they pushed at, it becomes less about skill and more about endurance. Legs strain. Arms tremble from holding shields locked in place. Sweat pours into eyes. The ground beneath them turns dark and slick. When a man falls, he does not fall cleanly. He collapses into the narrow space between formations and is crushed under boots, trampled by friend and enemy alike. Some die without a single wound, suffocated beneath the weight of their own army. Athelstan is somewhere behind the center, not detached, not safe. He moves along the line, shouting commands, reinforcing weak points. He can see where the coalition is strongest, where Constantine Scots are driving hard into Mercian ranks, where Viking axes are splintering shields. And there, in the thick of it, fights Constantine II of Scotland himself. He is old, over 60, but still formidable. Kings of this era do not rule from tents. If their men are dying, they are expected to die beside them. His sword rises and falls. His voice carries above the din. His presence alone holds parts of the line together. Nearby, Viking banners ripple, the raven's standard snapping in the wind. Olaf Guthfrithson commands warriors who have crossed the sea for this moment. If they win here, York is theirs again. The Danelaw restored. Athelstan humiliated. The fragile unity of England shattered beyond repair. The coalition fights like men who believe this is their last chance. And for a long time, it works. The Anglo-Saxon line bends, not breaks, but bends at T1 point in the morning. It seems possible that Athelstan has overreached. But the combined weight of Scots and Norse and Britons is simply too much. A crack opens in one section. Men spill through. For a heartbeat, panic flickers. But that is where discipline matters. Household troops rush in. Shields slam back into place. The gap closes. Edmund, only 16, is said to have fought ferociously in this phase. Not as a boy prince protected by veterans, but as a commander desperate to prove he deserves the bloodline he carries. The fighting becomes intimate. Axes hook over shields and drag them down. Short swords stab upward beneath ribs. Teeth are broken by shield bosses. Fingers are severed. There is no room for grand gestures. Every movement is survival. By midday, the field is a carpet of bodies. And then something shifts that it is impossible to know the exact moment. No trumpet announces it. No divine sign appears in the sky. But somewhere along the coalition line, a disaster unfolds. Constantine's son, the prince given years earlier as hostage, falls, killed in the chaos. Cut down among the common dead. Word spreads unevenly, like a crack running through ice. The air is dead. The bloodline is broken. Whether Constantine sees the body or only hears the news, something fractures. A king can survive humiliation. He can survive defeat. But the death of a son in front of his own army is something else entirely. The Scottish section of the line wavers, just slightly. But in a shield wall, slightly is everything. Ethelstan's men feel it, the subtle reduction in pressure, the hesitation. They push harder. The West Saxons lean forward with renewed force. Mercians, bloodied but unbroken, roar and drive their shields like battering rams. A small gap opens a single breach, and through it surge Anglo-Saxon warriors, not in neat formation now, but in furious momentum. Once a shield wall is pierced, it begins to unravel from within. Men who have been braced forward suddenly find enemies at their side. Panic spreads faster than orders. The cohesion that held thousands together dissolves into isolated clusters fighting for their own lives. The coalition line fractures. First, it is controlled withdrawal. Then it is desperate repositioning. And finally, it is collapse. What had been an organized front becomes a mass of individuals. And that is when the real slaughter begins. Ethelstan's cavalry, which had waited behind the infantry, now moves. Horses crash into fleeing men. Riders cut downward at exposed backs. Warriors who stood firm for hours are suddenly running, shields discarded to move faster, helmets thrown aside for breath. The Vikings turn toward the coast. They have ships waiting. If they can reach them, they can survive. But the Anglo-Saxons are relentless. They chase them across fields, through streams, over uneven ground littered with corpses. The pursuit stretches for miles. Men are cut down while trying to board ships. Others drown in the surf, dragged under by armor too heavy for swimming. Olaf Guthfrithson escapes, barely, fighting his way to a handful of vessels and sailing back across the Irish Sea with only fragments of the force he brought. The proud army that arrived in strength leaves as a shadow. The Scots have it worse. No ships. Only the long retreat north through hostile territory. If Constantine survives, and sources argue, he flees with what remains of his men. Behind him, the field is left to Carrion. 5 kings are dead by the sunset. 7 earls lie among them. The number of common warriors lost is beyond counting. And as the sun lowers, casting long shadows across the torn earth, the victorious army does not cheer. They're too exhausted, too stunned, too surrounded by the evidence of what victory costs. The ravens begin to gather before the light has fully faded. And the name Brunanburh, a place no one can now point on a map, becomes soaked into the memory of the island. But this is not the end of the story, because winning the bloodiest battle in British history does not feel like triumph. That it feels like survival. And sometimes survival leaves scars deeper than defeat. When the screaming finally stops, it does not end all at once. That it fades. First the clash of steel dies away. Then the shouting becomes scattered. Then even the cries of the wounded grow weaker as exhaustion settles over the field like a second dusk. The men of Athelstan stand among what they have done. This is victory, but it does not look glorious. Bodies lie in layered rows where the shield walls met, so tightly packed that some are still upright, pinned in place by the dead around them. Shields are split down the middle. Spears snap like twigs. The grass is no longer green. It is black-red and trampled flat into mud. The air smells of iron and sweat and something heavier, something final. Somewhere out there are 5 kings, not minor lords, not nameless chiefs, crowned rulers with banners, courts, bloodlines stretching back generations. Gone. 7 earls beside them. Entire dynasties ended in a single afternoon. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally cold and restrained, will later abandon its usual dry tone and record this battle as a poem, the only time it ever does so. Even monks, men trained to write with discipline and distance, cannot describe this day in ordinary prose. It is too large, too violent, too personal. They will write of ravens and wolves descending on the field. And it is not metaphor. The birds come before sunset. They circle, then settle. Black shapes hopping between corpses. The living soldiers are too tired to chase them away. Athelstan walks the ground. He has won everything he set out to defend. The coalition is shattered. The alliance that threatened to erase his kingdom is broken beyond repair. Scotland will not threaten him again in his lifetime. The Viking power of Dublin is crippled. York remains as he has proven, not just claimed, that he is ruler of the English. But look closely. There is no feast that night, that in roaring celebration, in triumphant parade through a captured city, because the men who survived know what it cost. They watched friends crushed under shields. They stepped over brothers to hold the line. They felt the shield wall bend and believed, for a moment, that they were about to be annihilated. Victory at Brunanburh is not a surge of it is a release of tension, a trembling realization that they are still alive. For Constantine II of Scotland, the cost is unbearable. His son lies dead in English soil. Whether Constantine himself was wounded or merely broken by grief, the effect is the same. Within a few years, he will abdicate and retire to a monastery. A king who ruled for more than 3 decades ends his life in prayer and silence. For Olaf Guthfrithson, survival is humiliation. He escapes by sea, but thousands of his warriors remain behind, rotting in foreign earth. He will briefly reclaim York after Ethelstan's death, but the momentum is gone. The great Viking coalition that once threatened to dominate Britain has been permanently weakened. And then there is Athelstan himself, already known for his deep piety, his devotion to relics, his patronage of monasteries. After Brunanburh, something in him seems to harden and soften at the same time. He gives lavish gifts to churches that he frees slaves in memory of the fallen. He prays not only for his own dead, but for the souls of his enemies. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. This was not pagans against Christians. Constantine was Christian. Many of the Britons were Christian. Even parts of the Viking world had begun converting. Brunanburh was Christian killing Christian on a scale the island had rarely seen. The monks who recorded it knew that, and it troubled them. 2 years later, in 939, Athelstan dies at just 45 years old. He is buried at Malmesbury Abbey, surrounded by relics he had collected throughout his life. Some historians believe the stress of Brunanburh, the physical strain, the psychological weight, contributed to his early death. The greatest victory of Anglo-Saxon England may have also shortened the life of the king who secured it, but what he left behind cannot be undone. After Brunanburh, no coalition of Scots, Vikings, and Britons will ever again unite on that scale against a single English king. The idea of England, once fragile, theoretical, now has proof behind IT that IT can defend itself, that IT can win, that IT can survive. The unified kingdom does not instantly become peaceful. More Vikings will come. Rivalries will flare. A century later, the Norman conquest will end Anglo-Saxon rule entirely. History does not stop at Brunanburh. But without this day, there may have been no England for the Normans to conquer. That is the quiet, terrifying weight of it. And yet, over time, the memory fades. The exact location is forgotten. The name Brunanburh becomes a puzzle for scholars. Later generations will remember Hastings, Agincourt, Waterloo. But this battle, perhaps the bloodiest single day the island saw before the Wars of the Roses, slips into near obscurity. Maybe that is fitting, because Brunanburh was not glorious that IT was necessary. IT was tens of thousands of men killing each other so that a political idea could survive. The warriors who stood in that shield wall did not think of themselves as founding a nation. They were fighting for their lord, for their land, for survival, for the man beside them. But every time someone later speaks the word England, they echo that field in 937 that every crown placed on an English monarch's head traces back, in some small way, to that shield wall holding firm under unbearable pressure. They won. And then they were forgotten, but the country they bled for endured. The strange thing about truly defining moments in history is that the people living through them rarely understand how permanent they are. On that field in 937, most of the men who survived Brunanburh were not thinking about nationhood. They were thinking about water, about wounds, about whether their brother or father was somewhere among the dead. They were thinking about sleep. But something fundamental had shifted. For generations, the story of the island had been fragmentation. Kingdom against kingdom. Wessex against Mercia. Northumbria against everyone. And always, the Vikings pressing in from the sea, raiding, settling, conquering, carving the map into unstable shapes. That instability was normal. Chaos was expected. But Brunanburh proved something new. That IT proved that when the kingdoms south of the Humber stood together under one ruler, they could not just survive invasion. They could crush a united invasion. That psychological shift mattered more than the body count. After Brunanburh, the idea of a single English kingship was no longer theoretical. It was blood-tested. It had faced a coalition of Scots, Norse, and Britons and had not collapsed. That changes how allies behave. That changes how enemies calculate risk. The descendants of Constantine II of Scotland would never forget the humiliation. But they would also never again risk such a massive all-in coalition against a strong southern king in quite the same way. The cost had been too high, too final. The Vikings of Dublin, under leaders like Olaf Guthfrithson, would continue to meddle in English politics. They would reclaim York briefly. They would raid. They would scheme. But the aura of unstoppable Norse expansion, the terror that had defined the 9th century, was broken. Brunanburh did not end Viking influence. It ended Viking inevitability. And for the English ruling elite, something else changed. Before this battle, unity had been fragile. Mercia had its own traditions, its own pride, its own history of kingship. Northumbria had long been semi-independent, even under West Saxon dominance. Loyalty to a single king of the English was still new. But when men from Wessex and Mercia stood shoulder to shoulder in that shield wall, when they bled together, survived together, and chased the same fleeing enemy, shared identity deepened. War has a brutal way of forging belonging. After Brunanburh, calling oneself English meant something stronger than regional loyalty. It meant you had held against the greatest coalition the island could assemble. That identity would matter enormously in the next century, because the invasions did not stop. New Viking ways would come under leaders like Sweyn Forkbeard and Nut. There would be civil wars, succession crises, betrayals. The crown would pass between dynasties. And eventually, in 1066, the Norman conquest would end Anglo-Saxon rule altogether. But here is the critical detail. When the Normans conquered in 1066, they did not conquer a patchwork of unrelated kingdoms. They conquered England, that a political unit, that a centralized crown, that a kingdom whose administrative foundations had been hardened by kings like Athelstan and proven at Brunanburh. Without that earlier consolidation, William of Normandy might have faced several smaller realms instead of one kingdom. The very shape of medieval British history could have unfolded differently. And yet, over time, Brunanburh faded. Why? Partly because it was too clean a victory. There was no dramatic last stand like at Hastings. No iconic death scene like Harold with an arrow in his eye. No romantic underdog legend. It was a brutal, grinding, strategically decisive massacre. And then political stability. Stability is less memorable than catastrophe, partly because its location was lost. No grand battlefield monument marked the ground. No towering abbey was built on the exact site to anchor collective memory. The earth swallowed the bones and kept quiet, and partly because the victors themselves did not mythologize it aggressively. The Anglo-Saxon poem celebrates the triumph, yes. It praises the courage of Athelstan and his brother Edmund, but it lingers almost obsessively on the carnage. The wolves, the ravens, the heaps of the slain. There is pride there, but also trauma that it feels less like a victory song and more like a stunned attempt to process something overwhelming. That tone tells us something profound. Brunanburh was not experienced as glorious destiny. It was experienced as catastrophic necessity, that a day when survival required annihilation. If Athelstan had lost, the unified kingdom would likely have fractured overnight. York restored to Viking control. Scottish influence expanding south. Mercia perhaps breaking away again. The fragile project of unity collapsing back into regional rivalry. Instead, because a shield wall held, the concept of England endured long enough to solidify into habit, law, bureaucracy, and identity. Think about that one shield wall, one line that did not break, and centuries of consequence followed. The men who stood there did not know that their descendants would speak a common language across the island, that parliaments would one day gather, that a global empire would rise, that the word England would travel across oceans. They only knew that if they failed, everything behind them, their homes, their families, their fields, would burn. They fought, they held, they survived, and history moved in a new direction. But there is one final layer to this story, because even though Brunanburh created England in a political sense, it also revealed something darker about it, that unity on this island often comes through extreme violence. That consolidation is rarely peaceful, that the birth of nations is usually written in blood. That pattern would repeat again and again in British history. Civil wars, rebellions, conquests, expansion overseas. The shadow of Brunanburh is not just the survival of a kingdom, that it is the template it set. Power proven through overwhelming force. Identity forged in resistance. Survival through endurance. And maybe that is why the battle slipped quietly into obscurity. Because remembering it too clearly would mean acknowledging how much of what followed was built on that same foundation. They were not fighting for legend. They were not fighting for poetry. They were fighting so that when someone asked, "Who rules this land?" there would be one answer. And after 937, there was England. Victory creates silence, but silence does not mean peace. When Athelstan dies in 939, only 2 years after Brunanburh, the stability he fought for begins to tremble almost immediately. The man who held the line, politically and militarily, is gone. And kingdoms built by strong rulers are always tested the moment that strength disappears. The first test comes fast, from across the Irish Sea, the same name rises again, Olaf Guthfrithson. He survived Brennenburg. He escaped the slaughter, and he did not forget. Within months of Ethelstan's death, Olaf strikes. York falls back into Viking hands. Northumbria fractures away from southern control. The unified England that had seemed so solid suddenly looks fragile again. This is the reality of early medieval power. It is personal. It lives and dies with the king. Ethelstan's authority had bound the island through force of will as much as force of arms. Without him, rival claimants and ambitious warlords test the edges. On the English throne now sits Edmund, the same young warrior who fought in the shield wall at Brennenburg. He is no longer 16. He is hardened. He remembers the crush of bodies. He remembers how close the line came to breaking. And he understands something important. Brennenburg proved England could survive invasion. Now he must prove it can survive succession. Edmund moves quickly. Campaign after campaign follows. He fights to reclaim the north. He negotiates when necessary. He divides enemies when he cannot defeat them outright. Slowly, York is brought back under English control. The fragile unity bends, but does not collapse. This is the unseen legacy of Brennenburg. The memory of that victory strengthens the resolve of those who follow. It becomes proof that the North can be retaken, that coalitions can be broken, that England is not just a temporary arrangement, but the island is never truly quiet. In Scotland, the descendants of Constantine II of Scotland rebuild. They learn from the catastrophe. Direct confrontation with a unified England is costly, so they adapt. Border warfare replaces massive invasion. Raids replace grand alliances. Pressure instead of annihilation. Power becomes a long game. Meanwhile, the Viking world is changing too. The age of scattered raiders is evolving into something more organized. Kings across Scandinavia consolidating power, building stronger states, looking west not just for plunder, but for thrones. England, wealthy and increasingly centralized, becomes a prize. Brennenburg did not end the Viking threat. It advertised England as worth conquering. And that advertisement will echo decades later when new fleets appear on the horizon. Not from Dublin this time, but from Denmark itself. But before we go there, something else happens, something subtle, something administrative, something less dramatic than a shield wall, but just as important. English kings begin to rule differently. After Brennenburg, the idea of king of the English solidifies into more than rhetoric. Law codes become more uniform. Coinage spreads with consistent royal imagery. Royal writs travel farther north with more authority. The machinery of governance tightens. You can see it in charters. You can see it in taxation. You can see it in the way nobles begin to think of themselves not just as regional magnates, but as part of the kingdom-wide elite. War forged the unity. Administration preserves it. And yet beneath that structure, tension simmers, because unity creates winners and losers. Northumbrian elites resent southern dominance. Mercian nobles remember their old independence. Border regions shift loyalties when it suits them. Viking settlers in the Danelaw do not simply vanish. They adapt, intermarry, convert, integrate, but they remain culturally distinct for generations. England after Brennenburg is not a smooth, harmonious realm. It is a negotiated reality, and that negotiation sometimes turns violent. Kings die unexpectedly. Assassinations occur. Rival claimants appear. The 10th century becomes a constant balancing act between consolidation and fragmentation. But here is the key. Despite all that turbulence, the kingdom does not fully break apart again the way it once did. That is the difference. Before Brennenburg, fragmentation was default. After Brennenburg, unity becomes default. Even when challenged, it is a psychological threshold crossed. And as the decades roll forward, the memory of that massive coalition, Scots, Norse, Britons united, lingers like a warning in the minds of English rulers. Never allow the enemies to synchronize. Never allow the North and the sea powers to coordinate unchecked. Future kings will remember that lesson, and they will prepare accordingly. But preparation cannot stop everything, because toward the end of the 10th century, a new kind of storm begins gathering over the North Sea. This time, it is not a coalition of desperate regional rulers. It is something colder, more organized, more imperial than a Danish royal project. And when it arrives, it will test whether the unity born at Brunanburh was truly permanent or merely the achievement of one extraordinary generation. The shield wall held in 937. The question now is whether England itself can hold in the face of what is coming next. For a generation after Brunanburh, the island breathes, not peacefully, never peacefully, but steadily. Kings rise and fall. Borders shift. York changes hands more than once. But the idea of England remains intact. The administrative machine built under Athelstan continues to function. Royal mints stamp coins bearing a single authority. Law codes circulate. The crown still commands from Winchester. And then, near the end of the 10th century, the horizon changes again. This time the threat does not come from a coalition of local rivals. It comes from a kingdom across the sea. Denmark is no longer a loose collection of warlords. It is centralizing, stronger, more unified, and its rulers are looking west, not just for plunder, but for dominion. In 991, a fleet arrives on the coast of Essex. Malden, English forces meet them. The battle is fierce. The English fight bravely, but they lose. Tribute is paid. Gold flows outward, and a dangerous precedent begins. Because paying off a predator does not end hunger, it feeds it. More fleets come, bigger fleets. And on the English throne sits a king very different from the men of Brunanburh. Athelred the Unready. The name unready does not mean foolish. It means poorly advised. But perception matters. And Ethelred's reign becomes synonymous with instability, shifting alliances, internal betrayals, heavy taxation to fund payments to invaders, Danegeld, silver gathered from across England and handed over to Viking leaders in exchange for temporary peace. Each payment buys a year, maybe two. It will be fought near Hastings, and the world will remember it. Yet even at Hastings, even in defeat, the structural unity of England, the idea born in blood at Brunanburh, does not vanish. William does not conquer a cluster of petty kings, that he conquers England, that a kingdom that had survived coalitions, Danes, civil strife, and succession crises. The shield wall that held in 937 echoes in the shield wall herald forms on Senlac Hill. Different enemy, different outcome, same idea, and what follows after 1066 will reshape language, aristocracy, architecture, law, everything. But the foundation William builds on, it was secured more than a century earlier on a field whose exact location we still cannot prove, that on a day when 5 kings died and a kingdom survived. The night after the first bronze blades were cast, the fires did not die. They spread. What began as a guarded experiment in a single valley became a rumor carried by traders, whispered by sailors, sung by wandering bards. The metal that did not shatter like stone, that did not bend like copper, that held its edge after blood and bone. That metal changed the balance of power faster than any king could control. First, it was subtle that a village that once paid tribute in grain now demanded ironwood and tin in exchange for protection. A minor chieftain who had once knelt to a distant city-state suddenly refused tribute because his warriors now carried spears tipped in bronze. One mine, one smelter, one caravan route. These became worth more than fertile land. And with that shift, alliances cracked. The kingdom of Arathos had long dominated the coastal trade lanes. Their ships were fast, their merchants ruthless. But Arathos relied on imported tin from the northern mountains. When a rival inland power, Velker, seized control of the tin passes, the sea empire trembled for the first time in generations. Not with an army, with economics. Velker did not invade. They embargoed. Bronze production in Arathos slowed. Weapons dulled, armor fractured, and slowly, whispers began in the capital. Are we still the strongest, or were we simply first? That doubt was more dangerous than any sword. Meanwhile, far to the east, another innovation was unfolding. A small confederation of river cities began experimenting not only with bronze weapons, but bronze tools for agriculture. Stronger plows, Sharper sickles, reinforced irrigation gates. Their harvests doubled. Populations surged. While empires fought over mines, this quiet river culture built granaries, and granaries built armies. But bronze was more than a tool of war and farming. It was prestige, authority, legitimacy. Priests wore bronze masks during ceremonies. Kings sat upon thrones reinforced with bronze studs. Law codes were etched onto bronze tablets, declarations that would outlast parchment and memory. Metal became permanence. Stone could crack, wood could rot, but bronze endured. And so rulers began to believe they too could endure. That illusion would cost them. Because the moment bronze became central to power, every empire became vulnerable to the same pressure point. Supply. Tin was rare. Copper was widespread. But without tin, bronze was impossible. Entire wars erupted not over ideology, not over revenge, but over trade routes that spanned mountains and deserts. Caravans stretched for miles, guarded by mercenaries who understood the value of what they escorted. A single shipment lost to bandits could shift the outcome of a campaign months later. This was the first age of global interdependence. Kingdoms that had never met relied on one another's earth. And when drought struck the northern highlands, when mines flooded and yields collapsed, the ripple was catastrophic. Bronze production plummeted across 3 regions. Armies delayed campaigns. Rebellions ignited in border provinces, sensing weakness. For the first time, leaders began stockpiling metal like treasure. Bronze was no longer just forged at It was hoarded at Inarathos. Desperation led to innovation. Alchemists and smiths experimented with different alloys, desperate to maintain military dominance. Some mixtures cracked under pressure. Others shattered spectacularly in battle, costing hundreds of lives. Trust in the metal faltered. And when soldiers begin to doubt their weapons, empires begin to fall. Yet out of this instability, something extraordinary emerged: specialization. Entire classes of artisans arose. Master smiths whose knowledge was guarded like royal secrets. Techniques were passed only within bloodlines. Apprentices were sworn to silence. Recipes for alloy composition were encoded in symbols understood only by guild elders. Knowledge became weaponized, and with knowledge came power that rivaled kings. In Velker, a guild of bronze smiths, once refused to produce weapons for a campaign they believed unwinnable. The army marched with inferior gear. They lost. The king returned not with punishment, but negotiation. For the first time in recorded history, artisans influenced strategy. Metal had reshaped politics itself. But beneath the wars, beneath the economics, beneath the prestige, something quieter was happening. Common people were changing. Bronze tools allowed forests to be cleared faster. Cities expanded. Walls grew higher. Ship hulls strengthened. Long-distance trade accelerated. Cultures collided. Ideas spread. Writing systems evolved as trade demanded record-keeping. Contracts etched in bronze formalized agreements between distant powers. Standardized weights emerged to measure copper and tin accurately. Commerce created bureaucracy. Bureaucracy created states, and states created history. Yet for all its strength, bronze had limits. It required coordination across vast distances. It depended on rare materials. It demanded infrastructure. And somewhere, in a region few paid attention to, blacksmiths began experimenting with something else: that a darker metal, more abundant, harder to master. It first. It seemed inferior, brittle, unpredictable, but did not rely on rare tin shipments. It existed in greater quantities beneath ordinary soil. The Bronze Empires dismissed it. That dismissal would become their greatest mistake. But that shift, that revolution, would not happen overnight. For now, the world still gleamed in gold-red light. Bronze blades clashed. Bronze shields rang. Bronze statues immortalized rulers who believed their age eternal. They did not yet realize they stood at the peak. And peaks are always followed by descent. The Bronze Age was not just an era of metal. It was an era of connection, of ambition, that of fragility disguised as strength. And as caravans creaked under the weight of ingots, and soldiers marched beneath banners stitched with bronze studs, The world tightened its grip on a material that would both elevate and undo it. But the cracks were forming, quietly. And once iron found its rhythm in the furnace, nothing would ever be the same. The first iron blade did not look impressive. It was darker, rougher, less elegant than polished bronze. When struck against a shield, it did not sing, it thudded. Bronze warriors laughed at it, until it didn't break. That was the difference in the eastern hill lands. Far from the major trade arteries, small communities had grown tired of depending on distant tin caravans. Their soil was rich with iron ore. At first, they used it for crude tools, hinges, farming spikes, nails. But experimentation continued. Iron required hotter furnaces, stronger bellows, better charcoal. It demanded discipline, and discipline forged resilience. Unlike bronze, iron did not require a fragile web of international trade. It could be mined locally, smelted locally, forged locally. It decentralized power, and decentralization frightened empires in Arathos. Scholars dismissed iron reports as exaggerations from rural traders. Velker's generals called it peasant metal. The great bronze kingdoms were too invested, economically, militarily, culturally, to pivot. Their armor gleamed. Their statues shone. Their pride blinded them. But in border skirmishes, something curious began happening. Bronze swords dulled faster when clashing against properly forged iron edges. Iron spearheads penetrated older shield designs. Iron farming tools allowed frontier settlements to expand into tougher terrain, feeding larger militias. Iron did not just arm armies, it fed them. And an army that eats reliably is an army that grows. Meanwhile, trade tensions worsened. The northern tin drought had not fully recovered. Mines that once yielded abundance now required deeper shafts. Costs increased. Merchant guilds raised prices. Smuggling became rampant. Banditry exploded along caravan routes. Entire micro-wars erupted over shipments no larger than a wagon. The bronze system was straining under its own complexity, but a single disrupted route could stall production across a continent. Iron did not have that weakness that in the River Confederation, the once quiet agricultural power. Leaders quietly funded iron experimentation. Publicly, they remained bronze loyalists. Privately, they stockpiled iron weapons. They were patient. They watched the coastal empires exhaust themselves over trade disputes and prestige wars. Then came the first major test that a coalition of bronze states attempted to suppress an iron-producing hill federation that had begun raiding trade caravans. The campaign was expected to be swift, a display of superiority that it was not. The hill fighters wore lighter armor. They moved faster. Their iron-tipped projectiles shattered bronze helmets. Their tools allowed them to fortify rocky terrain quickly. Siege attempts dragged on. Bronze armies were designed for dominance on open plains. Iron fighters adapted. After months of attrition, the coalition withdrew, not defeated, but not victorious. And in history, that distinction matters, because perception shifts power. Whispers spread. Bronze is not invincible. That idea was more dangerous than any army. Culturally, a divide formed. Bronze was associated with royalty, tradition, divine favor. Its color resembled the sun. Temples gleamed with it. Priests proclaimed it sacred. Iron was dark. Earth-born, unrefined. Common. It became associated with farmers, militias, frontier settlers. With practicality over pageantry. The struggle between metals became symbolic. Old order versus emerging realism. And within cities, younger officers began questioning strategy. Why depend on volatile tin routes? Why not invest in local iron production? Why protect distant mines at enormous cost? Elders resisted. Empires resist change most fiercely at their peak. But economics does not care about pride. Bronze weapons grew more expensive. Iron production became more efficient. Smiths improved forging techniques, learning to hammer impurities out, to control carbon content, to quench blades for hardness. What had once been brittle became formidable. Then something even more disruptive occurred. Iron spread faster, because it was abundant. You did not need imperial backing to start forging iron tools. Small communities could self-farm. Rebellions no longer depended on capturing bronze shipments. Power began to diffuse, and diffusion destabilizes centralized authority. The River Confederation finally revealed its hand in a calculated campaign. They deployed mixed formations, bronze for ceremonial leadership units, iron for infantry mass. Their supply lines were shorter. Their production was local. Their soldiers better fed. They did not conquer Arathos outright. They didn't need to. They captured key trade intersections and severed tin access. Bronze workshops slowed. Iron workshops multiplied. For the first time, bronze statues were melted down. Not for art, for survival. Symbols of eternity reduced to raw material. That moment marked the psychological turning point of the age. The Bronze Era did not collapse in a single catastrophic battle that it eroded, slowly, logistically, economically, culturally. Bronze had built interconnected empires dependent on rare materials and long trade chains. Iron empowered regions to become self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency breeds independence. Independence breeds fragmentation. Fragmentation breeds transformation. Yet, even as iron rose, chaos followed. Trade networks collapsed in some regions. Skilled bronze artisans lost influence. Some cities fell into decline when their economic foundation, tin brokerage, vanished. Refugees migrated. Knowledge was lost. Transition is never clean. The world grew darker, not metaphorically, but literally. Iron required charcoal on massive scale. Forests were stripped to fuel furnaces. Landscapes changed. Rivers shifted from erosion. Agriculture adapted again. Technology reshaped ecology. Ecology reshaped politics. The Age of Bronze had created the first interconnected world. The Age of Iron would create something harsher, more militarized, more expansive, more relentless, because iron did not shine like bronze that it endured, and endurance wins long wars. The old empires still stood, but their glow had faded. The next century would not belong to those who looked the most magnificent. It would belong to those who adapted fastest. And history always favors adaptation. That be why the middle of the century, the world looked different. Where once bronze had dictated hierarchy, the new black edges of iron now defined it. Armies forged in iron could be raised by a single city-state without relying on the generosity of a distant king. Local lords, previously impotent without royal backing, could now wield weapons that rivaled royal legions. Authority became physical, not ceremonial. A strong smith could change the balance of power as much as a king. In northern valleys, small iron-producing communities became semi-independent states. Their militias were disciplined, their logistics simple, their leaders smart enough to exploit the weaknesses of sprawling bronze empires, which still tried to maintain dominance through prestige, tribute, and traditional alliances. The first large-scale confrontation between iron and bronze armies was not cinematic. It was exhausting, grinding, and nearly invisible in contemporary chronicles. A coalition of bronze states marched against a rising iron confederation near the rolling hills of the Eastlands. Thousands of bronze-clad soldiers met iron infantry lined behind makeshift earthworks. Spears and swords clanged. Shields shattered. But the crucial factor was endurance. Iron blades and tools allowed soldiers to work longer, carry heavier loads, and repair weapons on the field. Bronze units broke from fatigue long before their enemy. News of the defeat traveled slowly at first, carried by fleeing merchants and messengers. But when it reached the capitals, panic ensued. Bronze kings could no longer assume invincibility. The cultural narrative that divine favor resided in bronze weapons faltered. Priests scrambled to justify why their sacred metal had failed in battle, while iron, once seen as humble and crude, became associated with practicality and success. Across the continent, urban centers began to imitate the iron militias. Smelting techniques spread. Farmers learned how to sharpen their plows into crude weapons. Artisans in isolated regions started experimenting with alloy blends, combining iron with trace amounts of copper or tin to increase resilience. A subtle revolution in metallurgy was underway, and while the emperors of bronze scrambled to maintain their fading prestige, regional powers grew confident. They no longer waited for royal sanction. Towns levied their own troops. Forested areas became fortresses. Trade hubs defended themselves with iron ballistae and fortified gates. Siege warfare evolved. Logistics became as important as battlefield heroism. It was a slow transformation, almost imperceptible decade by decade. No single battle destroyed the Bronze empires. No single king fell in a cinematic downfall. The change came as a tide, pushing on multiple fronts: economics, technology, military organization, and political structure. Those who adapted to iron thrived. Those who clung to bronze slowly faded. The implications were massive. Bronze empires have been centralized. They depended on tribute networks, trade routes, and alliances. Iron made smaller states independent. Power was now distributed, and leadership had to be adaptive. Rigidity killed rulers as surely as battle, and the landscape of war shifted again. Armies were no longer massive formations, pushing with shield walls across plains. Skirmishes became common. Mobile iron units harassed bronze supply lines. Raids replaced sieges in many regions. Battlefields fragmented. Kings had to think strategically about logistics, terrain, and production, not just numbers and morale. By the middle of this age, the first iron empires emerged. They were not empires in the traditional sense, vast territories ruled by a single monarch, but networks of fortified cities and provinces linked through logistics, metallurgy, and shared military doctrine. Armies moved faster, controlled resources more efficiently, and could strike multiple targets simultaneously. Bronze powers struggled to coordinate. Their rigid hierarchies and reliance on prestige left them vulnerable to rapid, decentralized attacks. Major battles now resembled chess matches more than simple clashes of arms. Leaders of iron coalitions exploited terrain, cut supply lines, and forced their enemies into attrition wars. A single misstep by a bronze general, a delayed march, an underestimated river crossing, a disrupted supply caravan, could doom an entire campaign. The balance of power no longer depended solely on numbers, lineage, or divine favor. It depended on adaptability, foresight, and efficient resource management, all made possible by iron. Even diplomacy changed. Bronze kings, desperate to survive, offered treaties, marriages, and trade concessions. But iron states did not negotiate out of fear. They negotiated from strength. Their armies could move, strike, and retreat faster than bronze forces could respond. Their political power rested on practicality rather than ceremony. And as a result, once powerful bronze kingdoms shrank, fragmented, and fell into vassalage. By the end of this generation, it was clear the age of bronze had ended. Bronze armies still existed, bronze kings still reigned in splendor, but the centers of power had shifted. Iron empires dominated trade, controlled resources, and defined military strategy. They were flexible, adaptive, and resilient, capable of surviving in ways bronze rulers could no longer imagine. History was no longer about ceremonial glory or divine right. It was about iron, strategy, and survival. The stage was set for the next phase, the consolidation of these iron empires into lasting kingdoms, capable of projecting power across continents, creating the foundation for medieval states, and ultimately shaping the political and military landscape of Europe for centuries. With the first generation of iron states proving their superiority in combat and logistics, the second generation of leaders began thinking bigger. No longer content to simply survive or defend borders, they sought to consolidate power, expand territory, and build states capable of enduring beyond a single campaign or ruler. The Riverlands, a confederation of iron cities united under a single council led by the shrewd warlord Kaelen. Kaelen understood that conquest was meaningless without infrastructure. Roads were repaired or rebuilt, bridges reinforced, and river crossings fortified. Supply caravans moved swiftly, and local militias were trained not just for defense, but for coordinated strikes across neighboring regions. Bronze armies, used to marching along predictable routes and relying on slow supply chains, were caught off guard. Diplomacy became as important as the battlefield. Kaelen sent envoys to formerly neutral territories, offering protection and trade agreements in exchange for allegiance. Cities that had been under Bronze rule for generations chose pragmatism over loyalty. The standard of iron dominance was clear. A ruler could promise survival and prosperity or face annihilation. Many chose survival. Meanwhile, Bronze kings clung to tradition. They adorned themselves in gilded armor, held elaborate ceremonies, and demanded loyalty through tribute. But their armies were slower, less flexible, and increasingly undermined by internal dissent. Provinces refused to raise troops, seeing iron-controlled regions as inevitable victors. Merchants shifted allegiance, preferring to trade with powers who could guarantee security. The economic foundation of Bronze empires began to crumble. Kaelen's generals perfected the integration of technology and tactics. Iron infantry was supplemented by light cavalry armed with iron-tipped lances, capable of rapid flanking maneuvers. Archers wielded longbows reinforced with iron fittings, capable of piercing bronze armor at a distance. Siege engines made of iron and reinforced timber could breach walls that had resisted bronze assaults for decades. Warfare was no longer about brute strength alone. It was about adaptation, timing, and resourcefulness. And yet, conquest alone was not enough. Kaelen understood that to build lasting power, he needed loyalty, not fear. Cities under iron rule were allowed to retain local governance as long as they contributed soldiers, raw materials, and tribute. Artisans were granted autonomy and incentives to innovate. Farmers were encouraged to expand cultivation with iron tools, ensuring the army and population were well fed. Bronze kings, in contrast, relied on coercion and ritual, approaches increasingly ineffective against a population that saw iron rulers as protectors and providers. The first truly large-scale iron empire emerged not from a single battlefield, but through decades of campaigns, alliances, and economic strategy. Bronze powers were corralled, subdued, or neutralized. Some kingdoms fell outright. Others became vassal states, providing resources in exchange for protection. And all the while, the production of iron surged. The more it was used, the more skilled the smiths became, further widening the gap between iron and bronze. That be why this stage, warfare had changed forever. No longer was victory measured solely by heroic clashes on open fields. It was measured in supply lines maintained, fortresses reinforced, trade routes controlled, and alliances secured. Iron empires could fight multiple enemies simultaneously, adapt to new strategies, and recover from setbacks in ways bronze empires never could. The landscape of Europe, previously dominated by ceremonial bronze capitals, was reshaped. Rivers became arteries of power, towns became fortified centers, and regions once considered peripheral gained influence by producing iron and organizing effective militias. Knowledge became power, production became power, adaptation became power. And as Kaelen looked across the plains from his newly fortified capital, he understood that the age of iron had only just begun. The lessons of bronze, prestige, hierarchy, tradition were still remembered, but they no longer dictated outcomes. The future belonged to those who could think, build, and fight differently. Empires have been reborn. Kings have been dethroned. And a new era of warfare, politics, and society was underway. One forged not in ceremony, but in iron, strategy, and relentless adaptation. That'd be why the time the third generation of iron rulers emerged, the world was unrecognizable to those who had lived under the bronze regimes. What had once been a patchwork of ceremonial cities and dependent provinces had transformed into a network of adaptive, fortified states capable of projecting power across vast distances. Rivers were patrolled, roads maintained, and armies disciplined not just for battle, but for sustained campaigns over months and even years. The heart of this new era was the Iron Confederation, a coalition of formerly independent city-states united under a council of warlords, merchants, and mastersmiths. It was not a monarchy in the traditional sense, though the council had a primus inter pares, warlord Kaelen's successor. The Rick wielded authority through sheer ability rather than divine right. His reputation alone commanded loyalty. The Rick faced the ultimate test. The remaining Bronze powers had finally formed an alliance, determined to reclaim dominance and restore the old order. They mustered armies that gleamed in the sun, adorned with gilded bronze helmets and polished shields, their banners proclaiming centuries of royal lineage. Their confidence was absolute, their arrogance unquestioned. They believed history and tradition would carry them to victory. The first campaign began along the eastern plains, a vast corridor that connected the heartlands of the Bronze kingdoms to the northern Iron provinces. Bronze armies marched in tight formations, confident that their discipline and numbers would overwhelm smaller Iron contingents. But the Iron commanders had learned the lessons of the past decades. Flexible formations, rapid deployment of reinforcements, fortified supply depots, and scorched earth tactics slowed the Bronze advance. Ambushes along rivers and forests forced the proud Bronze legions into disarray. One battle, in particular, became legendary. At the fields of Caldor, Bronze phalanxes faced Iron infantry, supported by mobile cavalry and long-range archers. Spears shattered shields, arrows pierced armor, and strategic retreats were executed with precision, drawing the Bronze army into traps. When the Iron flanks finally struck, the Bronze formation collapsed from exhaustion and confusion. The victory was decisive, but it came at a cost. The Iron armies lost thousands of soldiers, and entire cities had to be reinforced to replace fallen militia. Meanwhile, internal politics tested the Iron states as much as the battlefield. Rival warlords, merchants, and local governors vied for influence within the Confederation. Thurek navigated this minefield with skill, rewarding innovation, punishing betrayal, and ensuring that military decisions were guided by strategy, not ambition. Bronze kings, in contrast, struggled with succession disputes, rival factions, and the pressures of defending sprawling territories. Their empires were rigid. Failure in one province could ripple across the kingdom, collapsing morale and control. The victories of the Iron States had broader societal effects as well. Trade flourished along secure rivers and roads. Cities expanded. Fortifications evolved into permanent stone structures, blending practicality with military necessity. Artisans refined metallurgy, creating stronger iron weapons, armor, and siege engines. Farmers equipped with iron plows produced more food, sustaining growing populations and larger armies. Knowledge of logistics, metallurgy, and warfare became the most valuable currency, passed down through guilds and councils rather than inherited by royal birthright. WY the peak of this era, the Iron Confederation had reshaped the continent. Bronze capitals were reduced to symbolic centers of power. Their armies were weakened, their influence waned, and their kings increasingly dependent on Iron allies or tributary agreements. The age-old symbols of glory, gilded helmets, bronze thrones, ceremonial processions, no longer guaranteed survival. Adaptation, efficiency, and foresight ruled the day. And yet, even as the Iron empires celebrated victories, whispers of unrest began at the edges. Some provinces resisted central authority, some ambitious warlords tested boundaries, and rival coalitions plotted to challenge Iron supremacy. The lesson was clear. Even Iron empires, built on adaptability and strength, were not invincible. Power required constant vigilance, innovation, and sometimes ruthless action. The Age of Iron had reached its zenith. Entire regions had been transformed politically, militarily, and socially. Empires no longer relied solely on tradition or ritual. They relied on systems, logistics, production, knowledge, and mobility. Kings no longer ruled by divine right alone. They ruled by their ability to manage armies, supply chains, and alliances. And the people, from soldiers to smiths to merchants, had become indispensable actors in history, shaping outcomes as much as kings ever could. The stage was set for the next great transformation. The first unified kingdoms, built on the foundation of iron, prepared to dominate the continent and create the framework for what would become early medieval states. But even these emerging kingdoms would face challenges: internal rebellion, external invasion, and the unrelenting pressure of technological evolution. The Age of Iron was not over. It had only just begun to define the world. After decades of incremental victories, Iron kingdoms began to see the value of consolidation. Individual cities and provinces could defend themselves, but true power lay in unity. The scattered councils and coalitions that had won battles now sought to turn ephemeral victories into enduring empires. At the heart of this transformation was the city of Irid, strategically located at the crossroads of rivers and trade routes. Its rulers had spent decades building alliances, stockpiling iron, and perfecting logistical networks. The Irid became the model for centralization, a strong capital commanding a network of subordinate cities, each responsible for local production, military recruitment, and intelligence gathering. Loyalty was enforced through mutual benefit rather than fear. Merchants prospered, smiths thrived, and soldiers trained consistently, creating a self-reinforcing system of strength. Diplomacy played as crucial a role as warfare. Surrounding iron kingdoms were approached with offers of alliance or incorporation into the growing Irid Confederation. Ambitious rulers were given prestigious titles, control over resources, or shared command of armies. Cities that resisted were shown the efficiency of coordinated campaigns. Iron armies could strike simultaneously on multiple fronts, cutting off supplies and forcing rapid surrender. Slowly, resistance melted. Fragmented iron states unified under a single administrative and military framework without excessive bloodshed, and bronze powers, unable to adapt, were either absorbed, neutralized, or reduced to vassal status. The first large-scale campaigns of these unified iron states demonstrated the full potential of the new age. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands, supplied and reinforced through coordinated logistics, moved across vast regions. Siegecraft evolved. Iron-tipped battering rams and catapults breached fortifications that had stood for centuries. Light cavalry and mobile infantry harassed enemy supply lines, creating chaos in enemy rear areas. Even when facing numerically superior bronze forces, the combination of speed, discipline, and technological advantage allowed iron states to win decisively. Internally, governance adapted to support military strength. Councils oversaw production, maintained intelligence networks, and coordinated trade. Smiths and engineers were elevated in status, their innovations rewarded. Soldiers were trained year-round rather than for seasonal campaigns. A culture of meritocracy began to take hold. Leaders rose through skill and strategy rather than simply inheritance. Bronze empires, by contrast, relied on rigid hierarchies, ceremonial command, and the assumption that prestige alone could secure loyalty. They struggled to match the efficiency of iron states. Economically, unification transformed society. Iron plows increased agricultural output, feeding larger populations and armies. Trade networks, once scattered and vulnerable, became secure arteries linking cities under unified administration. Metallurgical knowledge spread rapidly, allowing armies to rearm efficiently and towns to fortify themselves. The shift from bronze to iron had begun decades earlier, but now it powered entire societies, creating an infrastructure capable of sustaining sustained campaigns, rapid mobilization, and territorial expansion. Yet unification also introduced new challenges. Rival factions within the Confederation tested authority. Ambitious generals and local governors occasionally rebelled, and distant provinces sometimes threatened to secede. Maintaining loyalty required constant attention, a delicate balance of reward, punishment, and shared governance. Unlike the old Bronze Kings, who relied on fear and ritual, Iron rulers had to manage complex systems of human motivation, logistics, and military readiness. Failure meant collapse, not just defeat on a battlefield. That'd be why the end of this unification phase. The first true Iron Empires had emerged. They were resilient, adaptive, and centralized, yet still capable of rapid response to external threats. Bronze powers were marginalized, their influence confined to symbolic capitals and small enclaves. Knowledge, production, and strategy now determined power more than lineage, ceremony, or wealth. The era of iron had matured, shaping the first continental kingdoms, their armies, and their societies into a framework that would endure for centuries. And in this environment, the next generation of rulers began to dream even bigger, crossing mountains, bridging rivers, forging alliances across regions, and establishing empires capable of dominating not just their neighbors, but entire continents. The Age of Iron had not just transformed warfare, it had transformed civilization itself. The final resistance of the Bronze powers came not as a sudden strike, but as a desperate, calculated attempt to reclaim their place in a world now dominated by iron. Old kings, clinging to tradition and ceremonial prestige, united their forces for one last series of campaigns. They raised armies from every remaining province, adorned in gilded bronze, polished shields reflecting the sun, banners proclaiming centuries of lineage. Their hope was simple: overwhelm the Iron Kingdoms with a show of force and reclaim authority before the new order became permanent. Iron commanders, however, had long anticipated such an attempt. Scouts monitored borders, rivers, and trade routes, providing real-time intelligence. Supply lines were fortified and flexible, allowing iron armies to move, strike, and resupply faster than the slower bronze columns. Generals coordinated not just for the battlefield, but for the entire campaign season, integrating cavalry, infantry, archers, and engineers into a system that was simultaneously disciplined and adaptable. The first major clash occurred near the high plains of Caldara. Bronze armies advanced in rigid phalanxes, expecting the traditional test of endurance to favor their soldiers. Iron forces, however, employed a strategy learned over decades, baiting the Bronze forward, fragmenting their formations with flanking maneuvers, and striking supply lines to weaken morale before the main engagement. When battle was joined, Iron infantry used terrain to their advantage, fighting uphill where Bronze formations struggled to maintain cohesion. Spears, iron-tipped arrows, and reinforced shields created a wall that Bronze soldiers could not penetrate. Elsewhere, Bronze forces attempted to bypass iron fortifications to strike at critical cities. But the Iron Kingdoms had anticipated this, establishing hidden garrisons, ambush points, and rapid response militias. Bronze columns found themselves trapped between multiple forces, harried from all sides, and unable to retreat without exposing flanks to devastating counterattacks. The precision and coordination of the Iron armies made their victories seem almost inevitable. Even in the midst of these battles, the Iron Kingdoms relied on more than just brute force. Deception, intelligence, and diplomacy played critical roles. Envoys infiltrated Bronze territories, spreading misinformation and sowing distrust among their allies. Messages promising rewards for defection tempted provincial lords to abandon their kings mid-campaign. Bronze soldiers, once united by fear of divine displeasure or loyalty to kings, found themselves isolated, uncertain, and vulnerable. The decisive engagement came at the River Taurin, a wide plain flanked by forests. Bronze generals deployed their largest force yet, expecting a glorious victory. But Iron commanders had fortified the terrain and divided their armies into overlapping units, capable of independent action while maintaining cohesion. When the Bronze phalanxes clashed with the Iron center, flanking cavalry attacked their rear, archers rained fire from elevated positions, and rapid infantry units exploited any breach to sow chaos. Within hours, what was meant to be a monumental victory for Bronze ended in total collapse. Thousands were killed, many captured, and surviving kings fled or surrendered. The aftermath reshaped the continent. Bronze powers were no longer credible threats. Territories that had resisted iron for decades now accepted centralized rule. Cities were absorbed, fortified, and reorganized under iron administration. Trade, production, and military systems standardized. Knowledge of metallurgy, logistics, and strategy flowed freely within the empire, creating unprecedented efficiency and resilience. Yet the Iron Kingdoms also recognized the cost of victory. Unlike the ceremonial campaigns of bronze, these wars demanded constant adaptation and relentless effort. Populations suffered, armies were exhausted, and infrastructure required constant maintenance. Victory was not inherited. It had to be sustained through diligence, intelligence, and foresight. Leaders who failed to innovate, even for a single generation, risked collapse. That'd be why the end of these legendary campaigns. The first true continental iron empires were firmly established. Bronze powers, once the pinnacle of civilization, were relegated to history. Iron had reshaped the world, politically, militarily, and socially. Centralized authority based on strategy, production, and adaptability had replaced ceremonial prestige. Soldiers, engineers, merchants, and administrators now held as much influence as kings. The foundations of early medieval kingdoms and the future of European civilization had been laid. The Age of Iron had reached its zenith, a world defined not by wealth or ritual, but by knowledge, resilience, and the mastery of steel. With external threats largely neutralized, the Iron Kingdoms turned inward, recognizing that maintaining power required more than victories on the battlefield. Survival now depended on organization, administration, and the ability to govern large territories effectively. Roads, bridges, and river crossings became the arteries of the empire. Unlike bronze states, where infrastructure was often symbolic, Iron Kingdoms invested heavily in logistics. Supplies, reinforcements, and trade moved swiftly across regions, allowing armies to respond to rebellions, border threats, or natural disasters with remarkable speed. Cities were fortified not just for defense, but to act as operational hubs, each with workshops, barracks, granaries, and arsenals, a system designed to keep the empire functioning even in times of war. Law and order were codified for the first time on a large scale. Local councils, led by merchants, soldiers, and smiths, administered daily affairs, while regional governors reported to the central authority. Punishments and rewards were standardized, ensuring that loyalty was based on merit and stability rather than fear or tradition. Iron rulers understood that social cohesion was just as vital as military strength. A restless populace could undermine even the most disciplined army. Education and skill became new forms of power. Blacksmiths taught apprentices the secrets of metallurgy, ensuring a constant supply of iron weapons and tools. Engineers designed siege engines, bridges, and fortifications, creating advantages that could tip the balance in future conflicts. Soldiers trained year-round, mastering not only combat but strategy, logistics, and communication. Knowledge, once the privilege of bronze aristocrats, now flowed throughout the empire, creating a resilient and adaptable society. Succession planning was crucial. Unlike bronze kingdoms, where lineage often dictated leadership regardless of capability, iron rulers emphasized competence. Heirs were trained in administration, military strategy, and diplomacy from a young age. Councils advised them, ensuring continuity even if a ruler fell in battle. Revolts or power struggles were mitigated by a combination of loyalty incentives, transparent governance, and carefully arranged marriages that reinforced alliances. Economically, the empire thrived. Iron tools increased agricultural output, feeding growing urban populations and sustaining larger armies. Trade networks flourished along secured rivers and roads, connecting distant provinces and integrating resources into a coordinated system. Wealth was no longer measured in gold alone. It was measured in iron production, food supply, knowledge, and the capacity to mobilize human resources effectively. Culturally, the Iron Kingdoms were dynamic. Artisans, scholars, and military engineers gained prestige alongside nobles. The arts, Architecture and literature reflected a society built on practicality as well as tradition. Celebrations honored not just kings, but achievements of communities, of victory in production, innovation, or defense. The era of rigid hierarchy based solely on birth was fading, replaced by a society where merit and adaptability carried real weight. And yet, rulers never became complacent. Rebellions, ambitious governors, and minor foreign powers always threatened the empire. Maintaining control required vigilance. Armies had to be drilled, fortresses maintained, and intelligence networks kept active. The stability of the Iron Kingdoms was fragile, but their adaptability made them resilient. Unlike Bronze states, which often crumbled after a single defeat, Iron empires could survive setbacks and recover rapidly, learning from each challenge. By the middle of this period, the Iron Kingdoms had not only survived the transition from war to governance, they had flourished. They were larger, stronger, and more coordinated than any previous civilization in the region. The foundations of what would become early medieval states were now firmly in place. Centralized authority, standardized law, integrated infrastructure, trained armies, and a culture of innovation and adaptability. The Age of Iron had matured. It had reshaped not only armies and kings, but societies and economies. The victories on the battlefield were complete, but the true triumph was a civilization capable of enduring. A civilization built not on prestige or fear, but on strategy, skill, and the unyielding power of iron. As the Iron Kingdoms settled into internal stability, a new challenge emerged. The world outside their borders was changing. Neighboring peoples who had once been isolated or fragmented began to consolidate, inspired by the efficiency and strength of the Iron Empires. Some sought trade, some sought alliance, and some sought conquest. The Iron rulers knew that their survival depended not just on armies, but on diplomacy, foresight, and subtle manipulation of alliances. The northern frontiers, mountain tribes had united under a charismatic chieftain, creating a force capable of raiding lightly defended border towns. To the west, a confederation of river cities, once bronze-aligned, had begun asserting independence, testing the limits of central authority. And along the coasts, seafaring groups of iron-forged adversaries threatened trade routes critical to the empire's prosperity. Iron kings responded with a mixture of pragmatism and force. Diplomats carried gifts, promises of autonomy, and the subtle threat of military intervention. Garrisons were reinforced, and intelligence networks expanded to track movements far beyond the capital. Siege engines, now refined through decades of use, were ready to bring any rebellious city to heel, while elite cavalry units patrolled borders with relentless efficiency. The first major confrontation of this era came on the plains of Wordvale. Mountain tribes attempted a surprise incursion, expecting the empire to be unprepared. But scouts had anticipated the move, relaying intelligence to the Iron commanders days in advance. As the tribes advanced, Iron forces executed a perfect trap. Lightly armored infantry drew them into a narrow valley, while hidden cavalry struck from the flanks. Trapped and outmaneuvered, the mountain forces were crushed. Victory was decisive, but it also reinforced a critical lesson. Even the most disciplined Iron Empire could be challenged by audacity, terrain, and speed. Diplomacy, however, remained as important as the battlefield. Cities that had remained neutral or rebellious were offered integration into the empire, with the promise of shared trade, protection, and influence in the councils. Those who resisted were met with a combination of siegecraft and psychological warfare, demonstrating that submission was safer than opposition. Slowly, the patchwork of formerly independent territories coalesced into a more cohesive political structure, one capable of coordinating resources, armies, and governance across vast regions. At the same time, the Iron Kingdoms began to institutionalize culture and law. Written codes replaced ad hoc judgments. Education for the elite now included strategy, governance, and engineering, while skilled artisans and merchants were granted status and incentives to innovate. Military campaigns were now planned with long-term political goals in mind, not just immediate conquest. Victory was measured not by the battlefield alone, but by the consolidation of loyalty, resources, and sustainable control. New threats emerged from outside the known borders as well. Seafaring raiders tested coastal defenses, and foreign merchants sought to manipulate trade agreements to weaken the empire economically. Iron rulers responded with fortified ports, naval patrols, and careful negotiation, showing that survival in this era required a balance between aggression and diplomacy. Iron kingdoms could no longer rely solely on military might. Intelligence, trade, and political strategy had become weapons of equal importance. Through decades of careful planning and decisive action, these iron empires matured into early medieval kingdoms. Their authority was centralized, their armies disciplined, and their societies organized around efficiency, merit, and adaptability. Yet beneath this apparent stability, constant vigilance remained essential. The empire's leaders knew that one misstep, a rebellious province, a failed campaign, a diplomatic miscalculation, could unravel decades of careful consolidation. To be why this stage. Europe was entering a new era. Iron was no longer just a material. It had become a symbol of governance, strategy, and societal cohesion. The kingdoms that had mastered its use could dominate regions, shape economies, and enforce law where bronze rulers had failed. They had transformed warfare, administration, and culture, creating a civilization built to endure far beyond the lives of individual kings or generals. The Age of Iron had evolved. From scattered smiths and city-states to unified, disciplined empires, it had reshaped the political, military, and social landscape. And yet, as these early medieval kingdoms took shape, new challenges loomed. Rival powers beyond their borders, internal factionalism, and unforeseen crises that would test the resilience of everything these empires had built. With the foundation of iron-based kingdoms firmly in place, the next generation of rulers faced challenges of a new kind. Victory on the battlefield no longer guaranteed stability. Now succession disputes, internal intrigue, and external threats tested the resilience of empires more than any army ever could. In the royal halls, sons and nephews of kings were trained from early childhood not only in strategy and combat, but in diplomacy, law, and administration. Yet human ambition proved difficult to contain. Rival siblings vied for precedence, regional governors pushed for autonomy, and influential merchants sought greater influence over decisions that affected trade and taxation. Intrigue became a constant companion to governance. Whispers, alliances, and secret deals could determine the fate of entire provinces without a single sword being drawn. Meanwhile, external pressures remained relentless. New tribes, emerging coalitions, and distant empires tested borders with raids, trade manipulation, or outright war. The kingdoms of the north, once fragmented bronze territories, began to consolidate in imitation of the iron model. From the east, nomadic horse warriors threatened the steppe borders of the empire, introducing mobility and tactics the settled kingdoms had to adapt to quickly. Iron empires now faced enemies that combined speed, cunning, and the willingness to exploit any weakness in administration or supply. Legendary rulers arose in response to these challenges. Kings and generals combined military brilliance with political acumen. They could command armies with precision, navigate courtly intrigue, and negotiate alliances with neighbors, all while maintaining the loyalty of vast populations. These leaders became larger-than-life figures in history, not because of ceremony alone, but because they balanced warfare, governance, and strategy in ways that preserved and expanded their kingdoms. One such ruler, King Eric of the Western Provinces, demonstrated the full integration of Iron Era innovation and medieval strategy. When a coalition of rebellious provinces threatened his borders, he mobilized multiple armies simultaneously, coordinating flanking movements with feigned retreats to draw enemies into traps. At the same time, he dispatched envoys offering clemency, trade advantages, and political positions to influential rebel leaders. When battle finally came, The coordinated campaigns ensured swift victory, while diplomatic efforts secured long-term loyalty. Eric's success was not a single act of heroism. It was decades of preparation, observation, and disciplined execution. Across the empire, infrastructure and intelligence networks allowed rulers to respond to threats rapidly. Fortified cities acted as both defensive bastions and administrative centers. Armies were trained year-round, equipped with weapons and armor of the highest quality. Scholars and engineers refined techniques for siegecraft, logistics, and communication. The integration of knowledge, organization, and military discipline created kingdoms far more resilient than the fractured bronze states that had preceded them. Yet despite these advances, life in the early medieval kingdoms was never entirely secure. Famine, disease, and rebellion were constant threats. Rulers who failed to maintain vigilance often faced swift downfall. Courts were hotbeds of intrigue, as ambitious courtiers manipulated alliances and sought to extend their influence. Even the most legendary kings could find their authority challenged by a combination of internal betrayal and opportunistic neighbors. Through it all, iron remained the backbone of civilization. Weapons, tools, and infrastructure allowed rulers to enforce law, maintain armies, and protect populations. But it was human ambition, intelligence, and adaptability that ultimately determined the fate of kingdoms. The lessons of the Age of Iron, logistics, strategy, and the integration of governance with military power, had matured into the blueprint for early medieval statecraft by the close of this era. Kingdoms were no longer simply collections of cities or provinces. They were cohesive, resilient states capable of enduring decades of pressure, war, and internal tension. Legendary rulers were forged not only in battle, but in council chambers, courts, and distant provinces. And the stage was set for the next transformation. The rise of dynasties whose influence would stretch across continents, defining the political, cultural, and military landscape for generations to come. The culmination of the Age of Iron and the early medieval kingdoms came with the rise of dynasties that would leave their mark on history. These were rulers who combined all the lessons of the past: mastery of iron, strategic warfare, disciplined governance, and the delicate art of diplomacy. Their reigns were defined not by a single battle or victory, but by the enduring stability and expansion of their realms. From the fortified capitals, dynastic kings oversaw sprawling territories, integrating diverse peoples under a single banner. They codified laws, standardized taxation, and ensured that local governors remained loyal through a mixture of incentives, oversight, and carefully arranged marriages. No longer could rebellion fester unnoticed, and no enemy could strike without encountering prepared defenses and coordinated countermeasures. The iron infrastructure, roads, bridges, forts, and supply lines, became the backbone of empire, allowing rulers to project power across regions previously fragmented and chaotic. War, however, remained an inseparable part of these dynasties' rule. Battles were no longer merely about survival. They were about consolidating power, deterring rivals, and shaping the future of Europe. Legendary generals, trained in both ancient strategies and contemporary innovation, led armies with precision. Sieges were calculated operations, ambushes carefully planned, and intelligence networks ensured that no threat went unnoticed. These campaigns solidified borders, neutralized rivals, and expanded territories in ways the Bronze Kings of old could only dream of. Yet diplomacy was just as vital as warfare. Kings forged alliances through marriage, trade agreements, and treaties, often balancing competing powers against one another to maintain supremacy. Ambitious neighbors were enticed into loyalty or intimidated into submission. The most successful rulers combined force and negotiation, understanding that long-term stability required more than victory on the battlefield. It required loyalty, respect, and a system that could endure beyond their own lifetime. Society itself transformed under these dynasties. Knowledge of metallurgy, strategy, and governance was institutionalized. Artisans, scholars, and military engineers gained prominence alongside warriors and nobles. Cities thrived as centers of production, administration, and culture. Trade networks expanded, connecting distant provinces and creating a flow of resources, ideas, and innovation that reinforced the power of the central authority. Iron was no longer merely a tool of war. It was the foundation of civilization itself. The legacy of these dynasties extended far beyond their own reigns. Their systems of governance, law, and military organization provided the blueprint for future kingdoms and empires. They demonstrated that survival and dominance required adaptation, discipline, and the integration of human skill with material power. Europe itself was being reshaped, laying the foundation for the high medieval states, the great dynastic conflicts, and the evolution of culture, law, and warfare for centuries to come. And yet, amid all their triumphs, these rulers never forgot the lessons of the past. Every victory, every city fortified, every treaty signed was a reminder of the delicate balance between power, strategy, and human ambition. The Iron Kingdoms had evolved into dynasties capable of enduring generations, but only through vigilance, intelligence, and a relentless pursuit of mastery over both men and material. In the end, the Age of Iron was not just a period of conquest or invention. It was the crucible in which modern European civilization was forged. The armies, the rulers, the engineers, and the people who labored in cities and fields all contributed to a legacy that endured. From the ashes of bronze and the chaos of fragmented territories, empires emerged, organized, resilient, and enduring. They were the first true kingdoms of a continent poised for centuries of history, innovation, and conflict. Every sword forged, every road built, every battle fought, and every law enacted was part of a continuum that stretched far beyond the lives of the rulers themselves. The dynasties of iron had succeeded not merely in surviving, but in shaping a civilization. And that civilization would echo through time, influencing the course of nations, empires, and people for generations to come. The Age of Iron had ended, but its legacy in strength, strategy, and the mastery of both human and material resources had just begun.